Reiser, intraset stretching and blood flow restriction are great intensity techniques in a lab setting. How do we measure the relative increases in intensity, EMG, CK, CSA?
So, who is this?
Joe Reiser.
Joe Reiser sounds like a scientist. So, basically, so intraset stretching. So, what's intraset stretching? That's basically what happens. Let me explain that first. Basically, what ends up happening is this. Let me give a background on this. When I was in high school, I started reading like a lot of scientific papers, and one of the papers I read was from Dr. Joe Antonio, and what he did was he took quails actually, and he took them and he hung weights to their wings, and just like weighted stretching on their wings, no like actual direct lifting, and these quails got more muscle mass, more jacked in their wings than I've ever seen in any study to date. I mean, and I've studied rats, hamsters, mice, everything you can think of. And no study I've ever seen from then to date have I seen that much muscle growth. So what we did is we adapted the protocol and studied it in humans, and we had people basically do intraset stretching. So what is that? Say you're doing like calf raises, and normally between sets you would rest. Instead, in this case, between sets you would let the weight stretch your calves. Or maybe I'm letting the weight stretch my calves, and Andy comes down and kind of presses a little bit on there. Now, clearly, this is an advanced technique, so if you're new, you probably don't want to do that. You need to be real warm when you do it. We found in our lab that actually increased skeletal muscle hypertrophy, which was cool, so it worked a lot. So definitely try that. We recommend doing strip sets. So you start the set off, go to failure, let the weight stretch you for 30 seconds, strip the weight, let the weight stretch you for 30 seconds, strip the weight, and do about a double or triple strip set. So his question is, how do you measure intensity?
Yes, best way to measure intensity.
Well, intensity is always going to be percentage of a maximal, so you sound like a scientist, so percentage of a maximal load. So typically I would judge intensity on the weight that's stretching your limb. So if you, I doubt you know what your maximum 1RM calf raise is, but if you were a scientist, and you want to look at intensity, I'd 1RM your subjects, have them get their maximal 1RM on calf raises, and then have use that as a percentage. So if say you're working at 75% of that, you're stretching at 75% of your 1RM, that's 75% intensity, and that's how we would measure in the lab. Can you look at it, if you're talking about electromyography, same thing. You'd likely do a maximal 1RM on calf raises, look at maximal muscle activation, and when you're stretching the calves, look at what percentage of that activation is actually occurring. So good practical question, good science question. What's next?
All right, we got a question from Giorgio. What kind of fiber is the best for gut bacteria? Soluble or insoluble also? Thanks.
Oh, what's the best type of fiber? Well, it really all depends on, like, to be honest, it's not like a best type. You're going to want a combination of both. If you're going to get ultimate like bulking action, satiating effects, a combination of both fibers.
You've been bringing up IMO and the soluble corn fiber.
Oh, are they talking about soluble corn versus IMO?
You can bring that up, yeah.
Yeah. Well, as far as soluble corn fiber and IMOs aren't a fiber. Soluble corn fiber is a fiber. So count that soluble corn fiber as a fiber. If you get it in like a protein bar, IMOs in a protein bar is not a fiber. Michael Don Johnson asks, "Hey Doc, your thoughts on test boosters for natural bodybuilding?" I think test boosters can work when you're like hypogonadal, especially. So if you look at bodybuilders when they come off of a contest, a lot of them I've seen testosterone levels like 50 on a range when the range is supposed to be 250 to like 1200, and 250 is like if you're 65, 70, 80 years old. So I've seen people with 50 coming out of a contest. We found that like those test boosters, a lot of them, and without going into the ingredients and stuff like that, like fenugreek is typically in there, tribulus, all this stuff. Basically what you're looking at is coming out of a contest or Matt Sharp in our lab found that if you're like in a catabolic state, it might prevent the decay of testosterone. So I don't think it's going to you might raise 50 to 100 points if you're normal and you're not training hard, but where it works best if you're dieting hard, it'll prevent a lot of the decay. Things like, again, like these ingredients. Okay.
Ready for another one?
Yeah.
Or do you go on?
Someone goes, what's your opinion on use of incremental pyramid sets peaking at, for example, a 4th or 5th set at 2 to 6 reps? Great question. It depends on your sport. If you're a power lifter, if you're going to near failure on each set, I don't think that's ideal. If you're a bodybuilder, I think it works well. So I said my quick answer, Paul.
Yep.
Now I'm gonna go true. So just real quick background on let me just go ahead and say why I'm saying what I'm saying. If you're a power lifter, you're looking at maximal loads, right? So say I'm doing 4 working sets, and I go like my 12 RM, and then I do my 8 RM, and then I do my 6 RM, and then I do a 2 to 4 RM. The problem is all those previous sets fatigued and masked what my true 4 RM is. So for max, that back in the 50s and 60s a lot was a major way that powerlifters would actually train, and more recently they're more moving toward like warm-up sets that are more non-fair and less fatiguing, working their way up to more of like a truer 4 RM, and then maybe reverse pyramiding. A bodybuilder, on the other hand, their goal is to destroy the muscle, right? That's the goal. In which case, absolutely, I say, max it, get close to max on each set. Pyramiding up is good. I also think reverse pyramiding could be good because use both techniques. So if you start off, work your way up to a heavy load and then work backwards, there's studies that may show from our lab and Dr. Lee Brown's lab and others that possibly you might actually get more reps on the lighter weights because of post-activation potentiation effect.
Okay. So how far away from the workout should you take antioxidants?
If you're taking antioxidants, again, I would separate by at least 12 hours personally. Someone goes, Lacey goes. Let's see what Lacey says. Lacey says, once you hit a plateau, strength growth, while eating in a surplus, your body feels drained and your workouts suck. I've been there. How long should you rest up? Is it an advantage to rest for a week before, getting back? Okay, that's a really good question. The thing to understand is that when you're consuming a calorie surplus, 2 things could be happening. One, the calorie surplus, while it might work initially, may actually cause you to eventually lose your pumps. It may actually become eventually insulin resistant, in which case that might be why it's not working anymore. Okay, calorie surplus is anabolic, but you got to realize if you look at like obesity and all of these things and insulin resistance, eventually a calorie surplus is still, if it's high enough, like if you're eating weight gainers every day, eventually it's going to start making you insulin resistant, and you won't be able to use carbohydrates as well. You won't get as good at pumps, as good at blood flow. So it may be that what you need to do is back down to maintenance calories and actually kind of improve your insulin sensitivity. So I wouldn't bulk for too long. Like don't bulk for more than like a month. That's one thing. If your nutrition is on point, you're not insulin resistant, and it is indeed training, I don't recommend taking a week off. Vladimir Zagorski has a really good quote. He says, think about a mountaineer. You're climbing a mountain, right? Why would you go halfway up, go back down, and then climb back up again? It makes no sense. So the same thing, the laws of physical training must be obeyed, and one such law is the law of continuous training if you want to keep making gains. That was good.
That was
really good. Yeah, I like that. That was on point. So anyway, the law of physical training is one such law, and basically what it says is this, that instead of stopping, what you need to do is taper. And so what I would recommend to you is basically back off your training 50% of your volume. It depends on how you feel. If you're coming in, your perceived recovery, which we talked about last week, is like a 3, back off 75% on your training, but sustain the intensity. So if you were doing like 4 sets of squats, warm up and do 1 hard set. If you're doing 4 sets of hard bench, warm up and do 1 hard set. Make sense? If you're more like a 6 or a 7 out of 10, then on your taper maybe back off 50%. As far as the duration, it's all going to depend on how fatigued you are. Again, if you're like a 3 or 4, you might need to taper for 10 to 14 days. If you're like a 6 or a 7, probably backing off 50% of your volume for 1 week is going to be just fine. It's a great question.
Awesome question. I got a good question coming up.
What's up?
Nathan Michaels asks, so during a fast, can you consume carbs and fats as long as you don't stimulate muscle protein synthesis?
During a fast, can you consume
Carbs and fats.
Carbs and fats, so long as you don't stimulate protein synthesis. Well, you wouldn't be fasting. So I guess the answer is no.
That was a quick answer.
Paul, are you proud of me?
That was good. That was good. That was good. To the point. To the point.
That's a record for the muscle PhD. Yeah, it's a record.
Another fasting question.
Yeah.
Would BCAAs be beneficial during a fast?
Okay, so again, technically it's not a fast, but the concept, that's why when they say like intermittent fasting or they say like every other day fasting, if you look at the studies, they're technically not fasting because they're on like 500 calories. So going on that premise, it's kind of a modified fast. I get the point. I do think that could be beneficial. There are studies showing that BCAAs, when complete fasting, spares muscle. So I mean, I think maybe two times a day or something like that could be beneficial. Someone goes cycling calories. Paul, listen, cycling calories. Do it. Yeah, I think so.
That was quick too. I like that.
That was actually my quickest one of the day.
How beneficial do you think mobility work is?
Now, I actually think it's very beneficial. Granted, I have a hard time touching my toes. Okay, but I am going to say this. I do think it is beneficial. I think there's a lot of studies where like stretching, for example, can actually increase things like strength. So just from the fact that you have a greater capacity to work, it's going to be great. And I think that there's some evidence that, like from our lab and Dr. Antonio's, that stretching can actually trigger hypertrophy. So, yeah. Okay.
Good question coming up next. So, a lot of people are always told to slow down the eccentric portion of a lift. So, eccentrically. Is there any benefit to that?
Right. So let's talk, just in case you guys don't know what eccentric training is, that's when you lower the weight. Okay. So if you're talking about slowing the weight, there are certain advocates that are like super slow, and I would say there's no. I mean, I'm not gonna say there's no benefit because it could be a shock. So I don't like to say no for anything. What I'm going to tell you is this: for the most part, purposely slowing down the eccentric load is not like your quickest way to growth. Now, you're going to go, oh no, but I thought the eccentric portion was the most important part of the lift, blah, blah, blah. Okay. While it is, if you look at studies on eccentric loading, what happens is this. When you're lifting eccentrically, you can lift more than you can concentrically. Okay, you guys follow me on that? Makes sense? You lift more on the way down than you can up here. Studies that show that the eccentric load causes more muscle growth than the concentric or lifting load are doing a percentage of that maximal lift. So say I can lift, for example, I can lift 100 pounds on the way down. And I'm working out at 60% of that 100 pounds. That's what? 60 pounds. In those studies, they're having them, and I can only lift 50 pounds on the way up. Okay, and I'm doing 60% of that. I'm only lifting 30 pounds on the way up. That's the comparison they're making on the studies. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
However, when you look at those same studies, and I were to put 30 pounds on the way up and down, in actuality, it'd actually be better for the way up. You actually get more muscle growth on the way up in that case. So those studies only work when you overload more on the way down than the way up. And actually, you're probably getting more growth on the way up. Now, what I'm saying is this: how do we lift? When we lift, we're constrained by the up portion of the lift, right? Not the down portion of the lift. And we fail concentrically, not eccentrically. So the only way to get that extra benefit out of the eccentric loading is not slowing the rep. It's I'm lifting weights with Andy, and he's coming over me, and he's pushing down on the bar on the way down. Again, this is an advanced technique. Okay? So, but also, does that make sense? Or say like Paul likes to do a lot of curls, like almost every day. So say if Paul's like...
No judgment.
So say Paul's like, come here, Andy. Okay, so say Andy's lifting, right? Come this way. So Andy's like lifting up, so lift up.
There you go.
So lift up, all the way up. On the way down, I'm assisting all the way down. Does it make sense? We should do that today.
That's it.
Yeah. So
Arm day.
So anyway, so that is how you would take advantage of it. And which does that make sense? And actually, there's also evidence that actually speeding the rep up, so long as you're controlled, results in more muscle damage and more growth.
Got any fast ones over there?
Let's see. Low, moderate, and high carb. How do you determine the amount of carbs for your diet? Right now, I'm low carb at 200. Is this accurate? But right now, I'm low carb at 200. Oh. I mean, that, to be quite honest, it's all dependent on you, right? So, if you take it, that's everyone's different. Like Trey, kid who we work with a lot, low carb for him, you know, he'd probably be in he'd probably be in ketosis at 200 grams of carbs a day. Lawrence Ballinger, who we work with, if you guys have checked out Project Mass, if you haven't, I definitely would check it out. It's awesome. But anyway, if you look at Lawrence Ballinger and Project Mass, he was in ketosis at 150 grams of carbs. Clearly low carb for him. I don't get in less than 30 grams of carbs. You're going to have to determine that for yourself. But I can tell you this, it's going to vary based on your training volume. So like when I was in grad school, I would train like 3 times a day. I could handle more carbs. But for me, like high carb at that time was still 250 grams, right? It all depends on what you can handle. So that's a little bit difficult question to answer beyond that. Best time to eat carbs after keto, pre-exercise. That's quick, right?
That was cool.
That was good.
Yeah.
So, difference between banded accommodating resistance or chained accommodating resistance?
That's a tough one. That's a really tough
I
one.
thought through this one by myself yesterday.
Yeah.
Pretty difficult.
Yeah. Do you have any insight on that?
The only insight that I can add to that is during chains, you're going to be using the forces of gravity working against you, and it's going to actually add more weight. But then there's the resistance and weight the same thing.
Yeah, and that's the point, I think.
So, I don't know.
This is like an age-old question. I'm going to try and answer something real quick. Okay, well, here's the thing. Both are going to work well. Based on my experience for strength days, like Andy said, you go on specificity, having gravity provide the resistance via the chains is going to transfer more to strength gains. Okay? Banded resistance is elastic resistance, right? So it's elastic resistance. You guys know all the laws on that, right? The point is that it's different than gravity resistance. So on strength days, chains might be better. For power days, or if you're trying to actually accelerate with a higher speed, I think bands could be better. One of the things is because you actually get like more velocity or more speed on the way down with bands. And so you get actually like more negative acceleration on the way down, and there's data that can cause like a lot of muscle damage. So bands could be good for like power, but also things like hypertrophy, because like on the way down they kind of give you a little fast velocity more so than chains. And I think that could be good for hypertrophy days. And then one of my favorite accommodating resistance is like we got the Prime equipment in the lab. If you guys haven't used Prime, find a gym that has Prime. If you don't have Prime, and if you have a gym and you don't have Prime, get Prime.
Game changer.
It's a game changer. Like basically, you can accommodate different portions of the lift with it. So that's definitely one of my favorite forms.
Last question. How serious is overtraining?
Is it a thing?
Is it a thing?
Overtraining does exist. So like I told you, like me personally, I've trained to the point where I've literally gotten deathly sick, and it's taken me like over a month to probably 6 weeks to recover. So if you have the mindset where you can push yourself to the point of fainting, or you can overtrain. Now, the problem is we have a lot of mechanisms in us where 97 to 98% of athletes never overtrain. Overtraining basically takes you months to recover from. What you probably experience, or what most people experience, is overreaching. And overreaching you can recover from in 1 to 2 weeks. So if you can recover in 1 to 2 weeks, you didn't overtrain, you overreach. And overreaching is a very real thing. Overtraining as well, especially for you military guys who are in the military serving our country. Thank you. For you guys, yes, that's definitely a key.